Now that's a parking spot.
Introducing the I may have underestimated the size of my car policy with accident forgiveness from American Family Insurance. Insure carefully. Dream fearlessly. Get a quote. Find an agent. Visit amfam.com.
Optional policy features not included in base policies. Review policy for coverages and exclusions. American Family Mutual Insurance Company SI and its operating company 6000 American Parkway, Madison, Wisconsin.
Welcome to Audiogyan with Kedar Nimkar, a podcast that documents insightful conversations with Indian designers, artists, musicians, writers, thinkers, and creatives of all types. Catch us on iTunes or visit audiogyan.com for more Gyan sessions. Here's your host, Kedar Nimkar.
Raja Ravi Varma, born on 29th April 1848 and passed away on 2nd October 1906. He was a celebrated Indian painter and an artist. Ravi Varma is considered among the greatest painters in the history of Indian art for a number of aesthetic and broader social reasons. We'll try and document a mini biography of him, more as a person and not particularly about his work. For that, I'm honored to have Manu Pillai with us on Audiogyan. Manu is an Indian author and a historian who has 3 award-winning books in his name. The Ivory Throne, Chronicles of the House of Travancore, Rebel Sultans, the Deccan from Khilji to Shivaji, and more recently, the Courtesan, the Mahatma, and the Italian Brahmin, Tales from Indian History. So, thank you, Manu, for giving your time, and it's a real honor to have you on Audiogyan.
No, thanks for having me, Kedar. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
So, I've come up with 10 questions, and obviously, I won't start off with a basic question like who was Raja Ravi Varma, but I'm assuming the listeners would be knowing some bits of it. So, if you can start by telling like who were his mentor, who were his guru, who was his teacher, and like some background about Raja Ravi Varma.
So, there is this, with Ravi Varma, there are 2 things. One, there is a mythology of Ravi Varma, and then there's the reality of Ravi Varma. The mythology is something that happens to any historical figure, usually in any part of the world, but especially in India, because we tend to sort of, all kinds of stories start gathering around a historical figure. As soon as somebody becomes famous, all kinds of almost mystical elements start accumulating around their story. And because of that, often you can find that the historical figure gets concealed behind a lot of myth making. And this is almost natural. You can call it the public relations of that time. Now we do it consciously with a much bigger speed. But in those days, it was through poetry and through these stories that were circulated about famous people that myth making took place. So the myth of Ravi Varma generally, makes us think that he was born in some kind of artless universe, and there was this divine gift in him that he was, there was a yearning inside him to bring it out. And then he, of course, goes to the court of the Travancore Maharaja. He was born in 1848, as you said. 1862, as a 14-year-old boy, he's already in the Travancore Maharaja's court. And there, the few artists who are there are very resistant to this young boy because they're all a little cautious about his talent. They think he's going to surpass them, and therefore they're all resistant and are not in a mood to give him any kind of instruction. So he sort of on his own picks up books, masters the art of oil painting, and then goes out and becomes this famous man called Raja Ravi Varma. Now, obviously, this, when he became famous, automatically around him, these stories started to gather. His own family members started sort of celebrating these stories where Ravi Varma became an almost semi-divine figure. But in reality, things were a little more, let's say, it was a little less romantic and a little more realistic. To begin with, when he came to Travancore, it was not an artless court. There was already several generations of artists who had worked there. So in the 1830s, from Tanjore and the Madurai courts, and the courts had gone, which is why there were artists who were looking for patronage. And so Alagiri Naidu and a lot of miniature artists and musicians, etc., had come to Travancore. So that was the original initial sort of phase there. Before that, various company artists of the East India Company period, they had come and painted portraits in Travancore. In the 1860s, when Ravi Varma arrived there, there was already a very famous oil painter called Ramaswamy Naidu, who was very popular with the Maharaja at that time. And of course, Ravi Varma, as a member of the aristocracy, as a close relative of the royal family, he was from a family that used to supply husbands to the princesses of Travancore. So he was well connected in terms of his family lineage and so on. So he was welcomed to come and stay and hang around in the court environment. And the Maharaja certainly saw talent in him and encouraged him. Now, of course, Ravi Varma from the beginning did have exposure to art, because his grandmother and her grandmother's sister, they had learned painting in the early 19th century from some North Kerala princes. From there, his uncle, a man called Raja Ravi Varma, he had picked up mural painting specifically, as well as some elements of miniature ivory panel painting, etc., from this Alagiri Naidu that I mentioned earlier. In fact, if you go to Ravi Varma's ancestral home, you will see that Raja Ravi Varma's miniature paintings are still visible on a lot of walls, and including on the walls of the family temple. They faded a little bit, but they're still there and visible. So he was exposed at home to, directly to his uncle, who gave him a basic amount of training in art. And then, of course, when he came to the court, he was exposed to oil painting, which is what really, caught his imagination, and that is what he would become a master of. Now, the Maharaja, as I said, encouraged him throughout the 1860s. By the early 1870s, he started, stepping out, and he was exhibiting his work. He was starting to win awards and medals in Madras, primarily from the British, for the kind of work he was doing. In the mid 1870s, when the Prince of Wales came to India on a grand tour, one of the presents that was given to him, both by the Maharaja of Travancore as well as the Maharaja's brother, who was called the Ilayaraja, both of these men gave Ravi Varma paintings as gifts to this British dignitary. So clearly his star was in the ascendant. He was starting to rise and become a prominent name in Madras. And already by the 1870s, his first portrait commissioned from an outsider, for which he was paid a fee for the first time, was from this lower level judge in Malabar. He had gone to a temple in coastal Karnataka to worship Saraswati. And then on the way back, he got this commission from the judge, and he did two portraits. One, a somewhat flat painting of the judge's family with his wife and children. The other is a much better and a more stylistically superior painting. It's a portrait of the judge himself, where he's wearing that whole Achkan style, garb, and he's got a turban and all of that. And you see the future Ravi Varma as the portrait artist emerging already in these paintings. But what really ends his connection to Travancore is in 1880. This Maharaja called Ailyam Tirunal dies in 1880. And his brother comes to power. And the brother does not like Ravi Varma. Basically because the brother didn't like the previous Maharaja. And therefore anybody who the previous Maharaja supported, the brother decided he would not support. So, because Ravi Varma was a favorite of Ailyam Tirunal, the new Maharaja Vishagam Tirunal decided to promote other artists. His favorite was a man called Manu Pillai and another one called K.P. Padmanabhan Thampi. These were the people that he decided to promote. But the straw that really broke the camel's back was, late in 1880, the governor of Madras came to Travancore on a state visit. And in fact, there is a painting ascribed to Ravi Varma, a very large canvas that was auctioned recently, I think last year, for a very large sum abroad. I think, or was it here? It might have been in the Nirav Modi collection, I'm not sure. But it basically depicts the arrival of the governor in Travancore, and the Maharaja is receiving him. And here what happened was that when the Maharaja and the governor sat down to talk, they discovered that the governor was very interested in meeting Ravi Varma. He had already met Ravi Varma in Madras. He had already seen Ravi Varma's paintings. He thought of Ravi Varma as a friend. So he asked the Maharaja to invite Ravi Varma to join them. Now, unusually, this was a problem in terms of protocol, because you see, in the royal courts, protocol and etiquette was supreme. And there was this custom that Ravi Varma was definitely a nobleman. He was definitely of high birth. He was a relative of the royal family. But he was still not equal to the Maharaja. So in the presence of the Maharaja, nobody could take a seat. The only people who took a seat in the presence of the Maharaja was the British, because they were superior to the Maharaja. So now what happens is, this governor insists on seeing Ravi Varma. Ravi Varma is invited. And this leads to a very weird situation for everybody, because the governor invites Ravi Varma to come and join them. Ravi Varma comes but says, look, I can't sit in the presence of my king. The governor says, well, I can't keep sitting while you're standing. So the governor stands up. And this means the Maharaja also has to stand up. And it creates this very awkward situation where Maharaja, artist Ravi Varma, as well as the governor are all standing and talking. And the Maharaja completely resents this kind of special favor that's being shown to Ravi Varma. Already he doesn't like him because he was the late Maharaja's favorite. And now he's found another reason, because Ravi Varma is receiving this kind of special honor from the governor. And soon after this, Ravi Varma gets the message that he's no longer in favor. He leaves, the darbar in Trivandrum, goes off to his wife's place in a place called Mavelikara. And from there, he's doing his own work, but he also reaches out to a man called Madhav Rao. Now, Madhav Rao is also another, mentor for Ravi Varma in that sense, because Madhav Rao is the one who tells him. Madhav Rao used to be Diwan of Travancore between till 1872. So for a good 12, 13 years, he was the man who was administering Travancore. So he was also very fond of Ravi Varma. And Ravi Varma wrote to him. Now, this is also something that doesn't come in the myth of Ravi Varma. In the myth of Ravi Varma, opportunities just land in his lap. But the reality of Ravi Varma is that, like a professional today, he used to hustle. He actually wrote to Madhav Rao saying, you had promised me, you had said that you'd get me commissions in northern India, you'd get me patronage in other places. Can I request you to invite me to Bombay or Baroda or wherever? That is how this letter is still available in the it's in Rupika Chawla's biography, for example. So that is how Madhav Rao, who was at that time in Baroda state under the Gaikwad of Baroda, he invites Ravi Varma to come and do some portraits for the Gaikwad's installation darbar in 1881. That is how Ravi Varma, who's till then basically a Travancore painter with a little bit of a reputation in Madras among the high society British crowd of that city, of the Madras presidency, he now moves into a pan-Indian space where he goes to Bombay, he goes to Baroda, and from there's no looking back. So the two real mentors, or rather the three real mentors in his life, are firstly his uncle, who was a painter in his own right. The next was Ailyam Tirunal Maharaja of Travancore, who for a good 18 years extended a lot of support to Ravi Varma. And finally, it was the Tanjore Brahmin, Sir T. Madhav Rao, who took him to Baroda and gave him further opportunity, after which Ravi Varma spread his wings and succeeded. He was always a hard worker. So given an opportunity, he made the most of it.
That's super interesting. In fact, while listening to the podcast with Amit, also, I was just trying to plot these so many names in chronology.
Yeah.
But so who were like if you compare the myth or the real aspect as well, like every artist has some sort of a sorrow, grief, or rebel, or I don't know what. Like there's some conflict. So. So two questions. So when he landed at the age of 14 in the court, like was there like a formal training already started? Was he like an accomplished painter in terms of skill and craft, or how was that? And the second is like what sort of background Ravi Varma had, which was there any pain? Was there any conflict which triggered this artistic rigor?
No, nothing that we know of as far as his early life is concerned. In fact, there are stories that he was extremely accomplished by the time he came, because a little after he had arrived in the court, there was this Danish painter called Theodore Jensen who came to the darbar, and Ravi Varma asked this Jensen whether he'd give him art lessons. And the story goes that Jensen was very scared that Ravi Varma was much better than him. So naturally, he didn't want to support Ravi Varma's this thing, so he said no. But because the Maharaja insisted, Ravi Varma was allowed to watch Jensen painting. And that's how apparently Ravi Varma picked up oil painting. And that's how when Jensen presented his portrait of the Maharaja and the Maharaja's wife, Ravi Varma, who had been secretly working on a portrait of his own, unveiled his own portrait, and it turned out that his was better than Jensen's. Now, this story is slightly exaggerated in the sense that Jensen may or may not have recognized Ravi Varma's talent, but one of the reasons he did not give Ravi Varma lessons was simply because he was only briefly in Trivandrum, and he had to do his work, he had to paint the portrait, so he had no time to give lessons to a 14, 15, 16-year-old boy on the side. He simply didn't have time. We, art historians like Partha Mitter, have said that the influence of Theodore Jensen is quite visible in Ravi Varma's art. So it's not like Ravi Varma completely destroyed this man's reputation by doing something better. Ravi Varma, on the other hand, picked up something from him and learned from him. In terms of early sort of anything traumatic in terms of Ravi Varma's early life, no. I think the only story about his early life is, in fact, when his mother was pregnant. There's a story that she was possessed by a yakshi in the family grove, where the shrine is, and there the yakshi, and that basically indicated that she was going to have some kind of a genius son. But this is also probably a later story. What did cause an interest in him was definitely his uncle's art that he saw around him, and later once he came to Travancore, the different varieties of art that he was exposed to, not just mural painting, not just ivory panel miniature painting, but also oil painting and so on. That is really what triggered his desire. But I think if you look at anything that is distasteful in his life, perhaps that is later in life, which is that once he decides to become a professional artist, once he decides to spread his wings beyond the Travancore court, this causes a lot of resentment among the people around him, because he belongs, as I said, to the aristocracy of Travancore. They did not work. There was no need for them to work. His family had a 10 or 12,000 acre estate. They used to get a lot of revenue from that. There was no reason for him to lift his finger and do anything, as a professional. In fact, in those days, to do art and do a painting and take money for it was almost considered it was considered something artisans and lower caste people did. Upper caste, semi-royal people had no reason to do something like that. That was definitely an attitude that he had to fight, because that was not the people around him, the milieu out in which he existed. None of that could understand what he was trying to do. None of them understood the idea of being a professional painter. So he seemed like a little bit of a black sheep in that context. And the one person who had even greater difficulty understanding this was his wife, because she was, she was also from an aristocratic family. Her sisters were the then Ranis of Travancore, so she also had royal connections. So she was definitely, not the type of woman to understand why her husband needed to have a career to begin with, and why, of all things in the world, it had to be something like painting. So for him, that was the real tension in his life. Rather than an early tension, it was towards his youth, in his 20s and 30s, this difficulty in the marriage, in terms of her complete lack of comprehension as to what he was trying to do, and the kind of resistance he met in his own wider community. Those were the real trigger points, as you can you could sort of frame it that way.
Correct. And obviously he must have reached out to a lot of people in the north while during this struggle to make his mark in the Indian landscape. So I want to understand, are there any references where it's clearly shows that there's some sort of a trait? So what made his work or him stand apart from the rest of the artists at that time? Was it the art, as in the craft and the art itself, or was the subjects? Because from my exposure, he's done a lot of mythological paintings as well.
Yeah.
Or was it like a good hustler, good marketing guy to promote his work?
I think all of them, you see, because talent he had, but the thing is, there were also other talented people. So, even the people in Travancore, as I said, Arumugam Pillai, K.P. Padmanabhan Thampi, Ramaswamy Naidu, these are all very talented painters. In fact, Ravi Varma himself also acknowledged the talent of another slightly younger painter called Mukundan Thampi. And he said Mukundan Thampi had a problem with alcohol and discipline. And he said, Ravi Varma once said that if Mukundan Thampi just focused, he could wipe all of us off with his brush. That was the kind of talent that Mukundan Thampi had. What made the difference was that Ravi Varma wedded his talent with genuine hard work. This was a man who had real ambition that he wanted to achieve something with his talent. Otherwise, see, if it was just art for art's sake, he could have sat in the Travancore Darbar. The Maharajas would have continued giving him a basic stipend. He could have painted to his, to satisfy himself, and lived in the comfort of his palace and lived in the comfort of his family's wealth. Why did he step out? Why did he go out and become a pan-Indian professional? Part of it is ambition. He wanted to be recognized. He enjoyed the kind of attention it brought. The other thing is definitely networks. A lot of other talented artists who came from either lower castes or more impoverished backgrounds simply did not have the networks Ravi Varma possessed. As I said, he's, through his wife, he's the brother-in-law of the Ranis of Travancore. His contacts are people like the Diwan of Travancore, the Diwan of Baroda, people at very high levels, governors of the British system. So he was very well connected, and he knew how to use this network to his advantage. It wasn't only networking. It certainly wasn't. It was talent married to hard work, married to a canny understanding of how to use networks very well. And that is what it was the combination of these three things that made him such a success, that made him such a phenomenon. And the fourth thing is also that because he was socially very high, because he was socially in the aristocracy, wherever he went, the treatment he received was different. For example, if he goes to a North Indian court, a regular painter from somewhere else will be received as a regular artist. There'll be no great, pampering or great treatment given to this artist. But because he came from the aristocracy, because of his royal connections, he was treated more or less in an equal fashion by various Maharajas. As I said, the governor treating Ravi Varma as a friend when he's only in his 20s, that gives you a hint of the kind of social standing he enjoyed. And that also opened doors to him in various darbars and various powerful places. And this was also visible in the kind of, the way he was compensated. A regular artist may be paid in money or maybe paid in land and things like that. But Ravi Varma was paid in things and goods that enjoyed a lot of prestige value. For instance, he would be given these very expensive robes of silk, brocade silk, things like that. He was paid sometimes in elephants. He was paid sometimes in jewels. So he was treated in a very different way to the other artists. He was socially and in a caste way, he was in a very different league. His networks were very strong. And because he had royal connections, and on top of that, he worked hard and had talent, all of this came together to give him that kind of profile.
But were there any then trade-offs? Because what the famous ones which are there are mainly portraits. So did he explore others than like what were the other forms of expression did he explore? Like there were abstract, and then there were like different painting styles as well, right?
Yeah, so
So
Ravi Varma
that
didn't
yeah,
go too much into
sorry. Sorry, to add to that, I wanted to also ask you, like, then how did this Dutch portraits Theodore Jensen connection happen? Because from whatever I gather right now, it's mainly India. So how was the connection with his contemporaries or his like other parts of the world?
Yeah, so he never went abroad. There is some suggestion that he was quite keen to go abroad, but it would have really destroyed his caste position back home. In the late 19th century, it was still Kala Pani, you can't go abroad, etc. Some North Indian Maharajas had started, but in Travancore, it was extremely unusual to go abroad. The Maharaja who was ruling from 1885 to 1924, well after Ravi Varma was dead, was a very orthodox Maharaja. In fact, even the previous Maharaja, the one I mentioned, who didn't like Ravi Varma, when he was in power, he even tried to have Ravi Varma ostracized by his community, because Ravi Varma was living in Bombay, and the Maharaja said, if he's living in Bombay full time, how do you know that he's doing all the rites and rituals as per his caste position? Because Ravi Varma was a purebred Kshatriya, as it were. He used to have a sacred thread. He had to do his Gayatri mantra in the morning, etc. So the Maharaja said, he's too far away. Nobody knows how he's living. It's impossible that he's following all the rules there. So he's no longer a member of the community. So there was even an effort to ostracize him like that. So there was no question for Ravi Varma going abroad. The exposure he had to Western art was through artists who came here. So even Theodore Jensen came to the Travancore court. Because often what happened is this Jensen was not a particularly great painter. He was not particularly famous or anything. But what happened was that a lot of B-grade artists from Europe, they could not thrive in the European market because there was better talent there. But they did find lots of patronage and money in India, because in India, Indian Maharajas were very eager to have Western art. So the A-grade artists of Europe, because they were successful in Europe, they never came to India. They saw no reason to come to India. And the B-grade ones who came, they got promoted by the Maharajas, who therefore ended up collecting their work. So Theodore Jensen was one of those characters who came to India because he was finding it difficult to survive in Europe. That's how Ravi Varma was exposed to him. In terms of other artistic movements like abstract art and impressionism and all that, it doesn't seem to have had much of an impact on him, because he was largely influenced by the academic realist style. That was what he promoted. That is what he was interested in. That is what he wanted to use to give a new imagery for Indian mythological art and for Indian portraiture. So, for example, in Udaipur, he was exposed to the old miniature style paintings of the Mughals and the Rajputana princes, where, it's that profile shot. It's almost like a two-dimensional profile shot that's done. It's not a fully alive 3D realist kind of work. And so he was exposed to that. He was exposed to other Indian art. He once traveled a great deal looking at sculpture and looking at various Indian artistic traditions. But he was quite fixed that it was the Western academic realist style that he wanted to take, and he wanted to take Indian topics, Indian themes, Indian subjects, and merge the two. So what you mentioned, the Puranic paintings, and that's the other interesting thing. Ravi Varma's initial fame to a great extent was built by his portraits. Even when he went, I mean, he did portraits, of course, in Travancore. In Baroda, he was commissioned to do portraits. After that, in Mysore, the Maharaja commissioned him to do portraits. So it was portraits, as a portrait maker is what he first became famous. But then he was commissioned to do these Puranic paintings for Baroda. And after he had finished them, and before they were given to Baroda, with the Baroda government's permission, he exhibited them in Trivandrum and Bombay and finally in Baroda as well. During the exhibition is when his eyes were opened to how popular these paintings could get, because the kind of masses that came for it, the kind of impact this had on people. There's that story, right, in the 1980s when the Ramayana was first aired on Doordarshan. Across India, people would, sort of bathe and get ready and sit at 9 o'clock in a sort of namaskar position in front of the TV, because they genuinely were they thought they were looking at their gods on TV. There was a genuine feeling of reverence. Now, take that back by 100 years, and in the 1880s and 1890s, this is the kind of impact that Ravi Varma realized Puranic paintings could do. When he recreated Sri Rama or Lakshmana, Mahabharata characters, Saraswati, gods and goddesses on canvas, people were struck. Because what did we have before that? If you look at temple sculptures, that's a completely distant, almost alien looking style, right? Because those figures have these very idealized sort of forms. The clothes are very different. Even female figures only have something like dhotis, a waistcloth. Nobody wears blouses. It's a very different era. In a Victorian age, you can't recreate that, because people would have frowned on that. Then you look at the miniature art, that's a different kind of art. Now you're seeing gods and goddesses draped like contemporary human beings. They look like contemporary human beings. They look very handsome and very beautiful. And suddenly you're struck, because you've never seen Hindu gods, Hindu epic characters depicted like this. You've never seen them in front of you come alive. People like Ravi Varma, people across India would recite the Ramayana, they would recite the Mahabharata, they would listen to great stories, they would even watch performances, the Ram Leela, etc. They would watch performances. But nobody had visualized gods like this. By even the way in which he took the sari, the style of sari that he used had just started to become popular in Bengal. But if you look at it, different women in India wore the sari in different ways. In Tamil Nadu, they wore it in a different way. In Kerala, the sari was not worn at all. It was this thing called the munda. In Maharashtra, it was worn in the Navvari style. Up north, it was worn in a different way. But the style that he used with the pleats, which some fashionable women in Bengal had started wearing. And remember, Bengal at that time and Calcutta was seen as this cosmopolitan hub. There, and the women of Bombay after that, they're the ones who started wearing this cosmopolitan pan-Indian sari. He started draping a lot of gods and a lot of his characters in that sari format. So if you look at his painting of Damayanti is wearing a modern day sari. She's not wearing some archaic, distant looking costume that you can't relate with anymore. She's wearing something that Indian women and particularly upper caste stylish Indian women are starting to wear. So he tapped into that increasing public appetite for visual imagery and gave them that visual imagery. He's the one who filled the gap there. So today, if you ask someone to shut their eyes and picture an Indian god or goddess, the basic format or the basic image that comes in front of them is inspired by Ravi Varma paintings and Ravi Varma lithographs, because he was filling a real big gap there and creating a new imagery for Indian gods.
Sorry, I want to ask you one question on the fly, because while I was reading and having a chat, and you also mentioned about Calcutta, are there any references where Swami Vivekanand particularly made critical comments on this? Because as you mentioned, traditionally gods were not picturized that way. They were like much more the impression which you get after looking at Ravi Varma's depiction of goddesses is much more westernized for that time. So are there any references where Vivekanand critique this?
So I don't know if Vivekananda directly said anything, but some of his disciples did. For example, Sister Nivedita hated Ravi Varma's art. She thought, for example, there's that famous painting called Shakuntala Patra Lekhan, where Shakuntala is lying down on the grass, in open air under a tree and in an open air setting, and she's writing a love letter. And Sister Nivedita had horrible things to say about this, saying what kind of well-behaved Indian girl would lie like this in public and write letters. It's impossible, and this is not national art, this is not good art, etc., etc. So that was Vivekananda's direct disciple. But this was also because the moment Ravi Varma died, till Ravi Varma died, there was no direct criticism of his work. There were some people who frowned and said, oh, gods should not be depicted like this. It sort of, reduces their glory, or it takes away their mystique, etc. But that didn't really affect him, or didn't become a major thing. For most part, he used to get very complimentary comments. And because major Hindu Maharajas, ranging from the Maharana in Udaipur, who's the Maharana of Mewar, to the Gaikwad of Baroda, to the Maharaja of Mysore, the Mysore and Baroda, the top league of Indian princes, 21 gun salute states, very powerful Hindu courts. When they are promoting his work, when they are collecting his work, it's very difficult for people to say anything. But the moment he died, you start seeing criticism of Ravi Varma coming in, because by then, he died in 1906. That coincides around it with the same years in which the partition of Bengal took place, which was just before his death. And after that, there was a huge spark and a huge increase in revolutionary movement in Bengal, as well as nationalist movement in Bengal. In the nationalist phase, people thought that Ravi Varma's style of using the Western academic realism for Indian themes was not patriotic. So it's a little bit like today's national versus anti-national debate, where in those days they said, oh no, this man, whatever his skill may be, by using a Western technique, he has demeaned Indian art. And therefore, there is something called the Bengal school that came up, which tried to sort of revive older forms of Indian art and sort of replicate that. But to be fair, even the Bengal school got criticized a little later by later artists of the progressive group. So it's not like any artist's work at the end of the day is fully appreciated. There's always somebody who comes later who has criticism for it. Vivekananda, it is likely, was exposed to Ravi Varma's work because Ravi Varma's nephew, who the Prince of Travancore, so his wife's direct nephew, was a prince called Ashwati Tirunal. He never managed to rule because he died as a young man at the age of 30. But as a young man, he had met Vivekananda. He had taken a photograph of Vivekananda. So it's possible that in this same circles that all these people moved in, Vivekananda would have been exposed to some of Ravi Varma's work. The Tagores definitely were. And, Rabindranath Tagore has spoken about Ravi Varma and how, at that time, Ravi Varma was such a big sensation. So it's very likely that in the Bengal circles, Vivekananda also had seen Ravi Varma. But whether or not he directly said anything, I don't know. I don't think he did, because I've never come across a direct reference. The references I've seen are from Vivekananda's disciples afterwards, not by Vivekananda himself.
Cool. And so if you can just also briefly tell, was there any particular milestone painting which made him famous, or it was like just growing organically through his network and
No, so
was there
so as I said, he first became famous among the rich and powerful because of his portraits. Everybody wanted his portraits. Then he was doing these, not portraits, but random paintings of, Naya woman playing the veena, Naya woman arranging her hair, things like that. Those were the kind of themes that he was painting. And this also, some grand people, major bureaucrats, divans, some British people, they wanted to collect. So his Shakuntala painting, for example, was used by Monier Williams as the frontispiece for a later edition of his book. So, there was that kind of reception in, powerful circles, in the high society circles. The real milestone, frankly, is first, as I said, that Puranic Paintings exhibition that he does, and he sees the public's response. And after that, he takes a business decision, which becomes the chief milestone that makes Ravi Varma a household name, which is to create prints of these paintings. So, he sets up a lithographs press, originally in Bombay, and then it moves to a place near Lonavala when the plague breaks out in Bombay. And it's through the press that Ravi Varma's paintings are now being produced at a mass level. Now, one of the reasons why people like Ananda Kumaraswamy, Sister Nivedita criticize Ravi Varma is partly also because they only saw the prints. And the prints naturally were a much cheaper version of the actual painting. Because in those days, printing technology was not very advanced. It used to be done with lithographs where, they have those litho stones, and then the stones are sort of used to imprint the image on the paper. So there were limitations in terms of quality and all that. But Ravi Varma was very keen that having achieved, now look at it, he came into the Maharaja's court in 1862. By the 1890s, he spent about 30 years in this field. He's earned fame with assorted Maharajas, Baroda, etc. He's made friends with the high and mighty of British society. Now you can see that he's yearning to go beyond that. He's yearning to do something that's not just for the high society people. And that is why he creates this press that's printing his works. And in the printing process, suddenly Ravi Varma's paintings, which only a few people had direct access to, ends up in the market where it can be picked up by anybody. So middle class families across India, Calcutta, Bombay, Trivandrum, Tamil Nadu, anywhere you look, there are Ravi Varma prints that slowly start becoming available. The news of the print's existence starts to get disseminated across the country. People actively start buying these prints because, yes, even in their puja room, they only have an idol, or they only have some other form of representing God. Now they've got an actual image, and they've got options. They can have a Lakshmi, they can have a Saraswati, they can have a Sri Ram, they can have anybody they want, because Ravi Varma's prints are doing that. It is through that Ravi Varma finally achieves the kind of fame that we associated with him. Till then, today's artists, for example, you take famous contemporary artists today, the English language press knows them. The people who read about art and culture, they know them. People who generally have a certain exposure in any kind of aesthetic field, they will know about them. But you go into a let's say a lower middle class family in Bombay and ask them, I won't take any names personally, but I'll give them the name of a prominent contemporary artist. They won't really relate to that person. They may not even have heard of that person. Ravi Varma, however, occupied that gap. Ravi Varma managed to realize that there was a huge audience there which could not afford massive oil paintings. And in his own way, he was creating what today we call affordable art. He was creating art for the people. He was not creating art in some kind of abstract, high and mighty, lofty way where it's like, oh my God, I only paint for myself. I only paint for art's sake. No, he was painting to communicate. He was painting to tell a story. He was painting to bring alive the epics in a visual way. And for that, the larger the audience, the better. That becomes a chief milestone in his life. It's really that commercial decision to say, okay, I've earned my stripes, I've earned critical acclaim, I've earned fame, I've earned wealth and money, I've earned, everything that, a person could desire. This is my way really of giving back. This is my way of taking this to the next level and making it something for the people. And he actually ended up losing money on that press. That press was never he was not a good businessman. His a descendant, who's the current titular Maharani of Travancore, Rukmini Varma, she told me this story about how he would not even handle money, because he came from this very Sanskritic high caste culture in Kerala, this very aristocratic culture. He used to look down on handling money personally. So if he used to give debts to he used to loan money to people and never bother about asking it back. There was definitely no question of taking interest. He would, even when people came with payment, he would not personally collect it, unless of course it was some Maharaja, because with Maharajas, if you don't take it yourself, it's an offense. But if it's other high-heeled clients who came, he would not deal with the money himself. It was his secretary, it was his brother, it was people like that who handled money, because he was not directly interested in money for money's sake. So on the press also, he lost money, but he was trying to do something. The press was not a means to profit. The press was a means to put out his art to a much bigger audience in the tens of thousands. And that he achieved, which is why even when the Bengal school criticized him, even when a phase began with the progressive artists, even when Ravi Varma went out of fashion, his name was still a part of cultural memory. And which is why in the 90s, if you look, the late 80s onwards, you see a resurgence of Hindu pride in India. Like there's a lot of, there's politically a lot of, this is the time, of course, when Hindutva comes to power, there's assertion of middle-class Hindu identity, etc. You see that Ravi Varma's trajectory also returns at the same time. His popularity also returns at the same time, because people immediately went back instinctively to his art, because his art was always there filling that gap.
Very, very fascinating. In fact, I was just going to ask you about this, the oleograph and the printing press. How did he manage? But yeah, you. So I understand like the amount of information and knowledge you have about this particular area is fathomless, and I can't really like keep asking because this can just go on and on. So if in this context for this particular episode, if we have to conclude, um, there is a lot of, we started off by, there is a myth side and then there is a realistic side.
Mhm.
So if and then in this answer particularly, you mentioned about his giving back to society sort of attitude. So if one has to, what would be like the one thing which one can imbibe out of Raja Ravi Varma, apart from his inspiring work, um, for today's artists and painters? And this is mainly because, like, we just ride the wave, right? Nobody really goes deep and researches a particular person to understand. And then there are always these shades. There's
Yeah.
no black and white for like big people.
Yeah.
So if you can just illustrate some black, some white part of it, and that could be like a just an initial start to further inquire into the subject of Ravi Verma or any painter in India.
Yeah, I think, for me, I just did a book for a foundation. There's the Raja Ravi Varma Heritage Foundation in Bangalore. So
Mm.
we were talking last year about Ravi Varma very casually. I was talking to the CEO and the chairperson of the foundation. The chairperson is the same Rukmini Varma, who's the descendant as well as the current titular Maharani of Travancore. She's also a painter in her own right. So we were just generally talking, and I was thinking about his portraits. As I said, his Puranic paintings made him famous, but even his portraits, I kept thinking there's something beyond just having the likenesses of the rich and famous. So I was like, who are the people in the portraits that he's painted? If you do a sort of historical analysis of the characters and the men and women that he's painted, my God, the kind of stories that come out of that. And suddenly Ravi Varma's portraits become a visual archive of the most amazing, individual political stories of that time. So, when he paints Sayaji Rao Gaikwad of Baroda, what do we see at one glance? We see yet another Maharaja in velvet clothes, silks, wearing these diamonds and wonderful jewels and sort of posing in a very regal way. But there is a backstory. That painting encapsulates the lifestyle and the story of a man who was utterly fascinating. Sayaji Rao Gaikwad, till the age of 12, was an illiterate boy working on a farm. He was distantly related to the Gaikwad royal family. When the royal family had no heirs, the then Maharani adopted him, and overnight the British trained him, thinking that we will train him to become a loyal pillar of the British Empire. And Sayaji Rao was accordingly trained and accordingly meant or expected to be this very pro-British ruler. Except that once he became a ruler, he developed an identity of his own. He started saying things that the British didn't like. He started resisting British sort of trespassing on his powers. He started, challenging them on many grounds. In fact, in 1911, when the British king came to India for his coronation, it was the Delhi Darbar, the third Delhi Darbar. At that time, Sayaji Rao Gaikwad did something that was called seditious in the press, which was that he showed his back to the British Emperor. He basically walked up and instead of bowing many times to the British Emperor, he just sort of lowered his head or tilted his head slightly, turned around and walked back. And turning your back to the emperor was a major breach of protocol. So that one painting of Ravi Varma, which shows this Maharaja who we think is, just a Maharaja, just another rich man that this posh artist painted, and nothing beyond that. There is actually something beyond that. That painting encapsulates a very fascinating story about a very fascinating man. And accordingly, if you go through each painting, you start discovering, my God, the backstories are just amazing. The people Ravi Varma has painted are actually the movers and shakers of the time. This is a time when nationalism has still not become aggressive. It's moderate nationalism. And that he's painted practically all the chief people of that moderate nationalist phase. He knew many of them personally, ranging from Gokhale to Dadabhai Nauroji. But he also painted the big bureaucrats of the time and all of that. And that led. So then the Ravi Varma Foundation, after this conversation we had, the CEO, Gitanjali Maini, said, look, why don't you do a picture book on this? So then accordingly, I ended up dedicating some time and doing research on this. And we've just produced a limited edition, not-for-profit kind of a book, which will come out on Ravi Varma's birth anniversary on the 29th, as you said. And that's when this book is going to come out. and it's called The World of Raja Ravi Varma, Princes and Patrons. And that it was in the course of this research that I really started thinking about what made Ravi Varma special. One, as we discussed earlier, you mentioned that it's all gray, but if you were to move it to black and white, one was definitely his abject and complete dedication to professional values. We live in a time when we're, if you look at millennials, the way we're raised, we're often told, oh, express yourself, do what you love and all of that. But frankly, as I said, lots of people have talent, but you succeed if you can marry your talent to discipline. You succeed if you can marry your talent to professionalism. There is no point being, in my case, for example, or the world I work in, there's no point being a very talented writer if nobody is going to read you. There's no point being a very talented writer if you're only writing for 5 other writers. You need an audience. You're trying to communicate something. And for that, you have to really learn discipline and time management and discipline and networking and all of that. And Ravi Varma, over a century ago, he managed to do all of this without mass communication that was possible, without internet, without any of this. This man, who was in a very comfortable position in a darbar in Travancore, could have lived his whole life like that, comfortably doing whatever he wanted. The fact that he stepped out, he got on the railways, he traveled to faraway countries, he stood outside the Nizam of Hyderabad's door for hours waiting to show his face to the Nizam and try and see if the Nizam will give him a commission. And the Nizam did not. And he wasn't disappointed. I mean, he was personally disappointed, but he took it in his stride. He was somebody who achieved a lot, but he could also take failure in his stride. He could also take negativity in his stride. He could remain focused on the task. He could remain focused on what he wanted to accomplish. For me, frankly, that is what makes him stand out. That is what really sets him apart. His ability to really bring his talent, but give it some very practical skills on the side, and together achieve something new. And at the end of it, Ravi Varma was still not a satisfied man. In fact, his this is something with which I end this new book, this illustrated book that I've done for the foundation. And we have this wonderful Malayalam letter that he wrote on the eve of his demise. And he had already lost his brother. His brother was for many years his assistant and companion. In fact, many Ravi Varmas that actually signed Ravi Varma is their joint paintings, because the brother would often contribute to the painting of the canvas, because it had become such a big enterprise. There were so many paintings to do. It was a two-man job rather than just Ravi Varma. And the brother had passed away suddenly, and Ravi Varma had got a major shock from that. And then soon after that, his own son, who had also started assisting him, a man called Rama Varma sadly did not become very famous, and he didn't have his father's talent, but he was also helping Ravi Varma, and Ravi Varma was sort of trying to groom him, etc. And Ravi Varma's son, this Rama Varma, falls ill. His older son, whose name was Kerala Varma, that son had become a drunkard, so he was already disappointed about that son. So you've got two sons. The older one is completely out of your hands, and tragic situation where the father is a great man, the son has become this profligate character. Younger son is trying to do art, doesn't have your talent, but here he is also sick, and Ravi Varma has also lost his brother. And there's this moment of vulnerability where in Malayalam, Ravi Varma refers to himself and asks why, maybe, and says that maybe it's because he's a papi that God is treating him like this. Papi means sinner, pabam or pap. So he's basically, just a year before his death, he's basically looking inward and thinking that, for all that I've achieved, whether it's fame, whether it's, taking art to the masses, whether it's anything else, at the end of the day, the people he loved, his brothers left him, his son is ill, the other son is not doing well. He's got very human emotions at the end of it. At the end of it, he's a little bit of a broken man. After achieving all this, after becoming the Raja Ravi Varma that the world is going to commemorate, what I discovered was that Raja Ravi Varma was also very human. And that final moment of his life, the final year of his life, he was in a very vulnerable, tender phase, not quite sure, what all this achievement meant, when deep inside he was not at peace.
Wow. So brilliant. I think, yeah, I mean, I'm run out of questions, and from my limited knowledge and the basic research which I had done, you have shared some really, really noteworthy insights about Raja Ravi Varma. I know this is yeah. So cool. I think on that note, we can conclude this episode, but keep our ongoing quest to understand Raja Ravi Varma's both the mythic and the real side.
And there's a lot to
Uh,
understand. As you know, he's one of those people. In many ways, we've just scratched the surface. There's so much more to
yeah,
do.
correct. Yeah, I mean that's the sad part that uh, this podcast medium can just happen like as Amit Verma's long conversation, but unfortunately the depth in the subject and to understand and come up with more nuanced question is something which I'm working towards. But it was really great talking to you, and so thankful that you generously spoke about Raja Ravi Varma. I'm really happy for that.
Thanks, Kedar.
Cool. So you can follow Manu Pillai on Twitter at Unam Pillai, which is Manu's Ulta, and visit manupillai.com to read more about his work and his books. And when is this Raja Ravi Varma's book? Is it out?
No, so
I
the thing
believe.
is, we thought we'd bring out the limited edition series end of this month, and there was a big event planned in Bangalore, and we were flying down some people from America, art historians, etc., for it. And the
Hmm.
foundation was really going out of its way to celebrate this as a huge thing. But then, as you know, this is the age of coronavirus, so there's definitely no public event happening now. So what we're doing is the limited edition print series will definitely come out, but as I said, the foundation's idea is to put this research out there for people to refer to. So on the 29th, on his birth anniversary, as an online event, I think the book will probably be placed in an online situation where people can refer to it, etc. And we'll find a way to physically celebrate Ravi Verma whenever Corona goes away, and we can bring back some of the light and color from Ravi Verma's paintings into our actual lives.
Yeah, sure. So I'll see if I can just release this episode during the 29th April
Oh, that would be lovely.
weekend
Yeah.
itself. Cool. On that note, thanks a lot, Manu. Thanks a lot. I don't have words to thank you. Yeah.
Thanks, Kedar.
And that's it from today's Gyan session. Catch us on iTunes, Savan, Stitcher, or any podcasting app you use. Do rate us on iTunes and follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Stay tuned for more Gyan on Audiogyan.com. Till then, bye.
Now that's a parking spot.
Introducing the I may have underestimated the size of my car policy with accident forgiveness from American Family Insurance. Insure carefully. Dream fearlessly. Get a quote. Find an agent. Visit amfam.com.
Optional policy features not included in base policies. Review policy for coverages and exclusions. American Family Mutual Insurance Company SI and its operating company 6000 American Parkway, Madison, Wisconsin.